What is the Libertarian position on the Supreme Court's recent decision on affirmative action? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled and compromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners, as always.
Yeah, I got a little bit of different backdrop today. I'm over at Freedom Fest in Memphis, going to be doing a mock trial on open borders. I'm actually being accused in a criminal proceeding of supporting open borders, me along with Brian Kaplan, professor of economics at George Mason University, great guy and great advocate of open borders. And our defense attorney is an actual lawyer, and she's being accused too of advocating open borders. Our own lawyers in the dock here too. And I'm almost certain that it's all being live streamed. So when you see this video, it'll probably be on Thursday or on Friday, and that's the time of the mock trial. And the mock trial's at 5:30, I believe, Central Time. So hope you all tune in. It's going to be a real fun event, I believe. So Richard, we've had a big ruling of the Supreme Court with respect to affirmative action. So I thought you and I ought to address this issue from our standard principled libertarian perspective, that the policy of affirmative action in higher education has been there for a very long time. What it entailed was universities and colleges having a program that gave preference to people of racial minorities, so that they would get preference over, let's say, a white guy. A black person or Hispanic would be given preference over a white guy. And the idea is to make up for slavery and a century or more of racial prejudice, and to give people an opportunity to attend higher education when they might not have that opportunity in a regular society where the universities could make that call on their own. So, but I take a different slant on this, Richard. I think we need to ask ourselves, why is it that the federal government, or in this case, the Supreme Court, has the power to tell a university that it cannot do this? Why shouldn't a university or a college that wants to have an affirmative action program do that? Certainly there's bound to be some colleges and universities that believe in this, not because it's mandated or required, but simply because as a matter of policy, they would like to establish it. And if I understand this Supreme Court ruling correctly, they're prohibited from doing that now, even if they want to. The court has said that this is unconstitutional. Well, when we talk about colleges and universities, we're talking about three different types of colleges and universities. One type is a state-owned university or college, where the state owns the institution and it's running it, it's operating it, it's hiring the teachers, setting the curriculum, setting the policies. The other one is a private college or university that receives state funds, or whose students receive state grants, or both. And then there's the third one, very rare, where you have a private institution that receives no government grants and does not permit its students to receive government grants. Now, I can understand why a state-owned university would be subject to government rules and regulations. I mean, the state owns it. And so if the Supreme Court says, well, a state institution will not be permitted to discriminate on the basis of race, color, creed, I don't have any problem with that. I don't think the state should be discriminating. I would question, though, what business the state has in owning and operating a university or college. Why is that the state's business? And then on the state subsidized private university, I would say, what business does the state have subsidizing a university? So the basic question I'm asking, Richard, is why shouldn't a university, especially a private university, and I think all universities should be private, I don't think the state should have any universities or colleges, why shouldn't a private university have the right to do whatever it wants, to establish whatever policy it wants? If it wants affirmative action, it should have affirmative action. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. Let the consumers decide. If consumers don't like a particular policy of a college or university, they can go elsewhere, or they can protest or boycott, socially ostracize, condemn the university, trying to get it to change its policies. The only reason the state gets its nose into this business is because of state support of colleges and universities. And I say that that's the root of the problem. It's not the affirmative action. It's the fact that state colleges and universities, including private ones, are on the state dole. And if you eliminated that dole, which I believe you should do, then the college and university would be free to run its operations the way it wants. What do you think?
Well, I think that there's two dimensions to this, one of which you've emphasized. The other is a broader philosophical perspective. And that is what might a classical liberal who believes in individual liberty, equality before the law, judging a person by the content of their character, to use that phrase, which is part of the individualist philosophy. How would a classical liberal think people should interact and associate with each other? I'll speak for myself. I believe that there are things that are accidents of birth that at the end of the day are inconsequential. Some people have blonde hair, some hair are brunettes, some are redheads. Some have blue eyes, some have brown eyes. Some are right-handed, others are left-handed. Some are tall, some are short. Some come from ancestral backgrounds of Asia or Africa or Latin America. Others come from Europe and Europeanized North America. And I would say all of these things are inconsequential in judging an individual as an individual. So in my opinion, if an institution, whether it be a private business or an institution of higher learning, were to be a truly liberal arts institution, liberal in its philosophy, it should just be judging people by merit if you believe in this individualist philosophy of judging individuals rather than people as the accidents of group. For example, let's take an institution where I taught for a long time, back in the last century. That sounds weird. Hillsdale College. Now, Hillsdale College was threatened with government sanctions because it was judging people as individuals and not by race counting back in the 1970s. And it went to court, and Hillsdale College said, we don't come under any of the Title IX or affirmative action requirements because we don't take government money. They won. Excuse me, they lost that case. But they had been taking some government money in the form of like student loans and Pell Grants or whatever it was. And so the then president of Hillsdale College, George Roach, basically said, well, we won't take any more government dollars. And if we don't take government dollars, we can follow the philosophy of admissions and judging candidates on our basis of individual merit. And if an individual meets our standards of qualification and merit, regardless of what he looks at, because we had been accepting, that is Hillsdale College, had been accepting women and blacks on an equal basis with whites from before the Civil War, we refused to be accused of implicit racist tendencies that require government control. We will just turn our back on government money and follow our course of action. And Hillsdale did, and looking at the long run, successfully. What they did, they bucked race counting and said, we're judging people as individuals, and by not accepting government money, they could buck the government standard. Now, and I would believe in such a philosophy, and that was one of the things that I liked about teaching at Hillsdale College in the years that I was there. It practiced the individualist judgment of people that supposedly advocates of liberty preach. However, the issue precisely comes up when either a government owns an institution of higher learning, many colleges and universities are state-owned, or in which students or faculty or programs on campus receive large amounts of government money. Because that was the problem that Hillsdale College faced. Acceptance of $1 of government money, regardless of how that dollar was streaming into the institution, linked that institution to the government rules, regulations, standards, prohibitions, and demands. And you hit it on the head. Whether it be a state institution or a private institution that has these conduits of government grants, government research money, government scholarships, et cetera, it's the government money that dictates what that institution has to follow. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And the government has taxpayer dollars, and the taxpayer dollars flow to these institutions, and the government determines the tune. Now, the only way to prevent the government from either telling you to look at students on a colorblind basis, or if you believe, as an outlook historically, sociologically, that it would be right to give certain legs up to groups or individuals who you believe have legacies of disadvantage for one reason or another in the past, the only way you have that latitude and liberty to be colorblind or to be color noticing is to be free of government money. See, now it's on the other foot. Back with Hillsdale College, you wanted to be colorblind, which the institution was following, and you were penalized for that. Now you want to be color noticing, and the government, through the Supreme Court, is now going to penalize you for that. The only way to give individuals the freedom to decide these things is to free education from kindergarten through the PhD from the government trough of dollars in one form or another. Now, what would institutions follow? It is clear today, and as an individualist liberal, I challenge virtually all of the woke philosophy, its premises, its implications, its applications as inconsistent with the ideals upon which the country was based. However, if an individual wishes to do this, if a private enterprise wishes to do this, if a private institution of higher learning wishes to do that in a free society, they are allowed to discriminate. And if you want to discriminate in favor of Blacks, and as the case concerning Harvard and North Carolina, discriminating against Asians, an ethnic minority has a mark against it. And what is its mark against it under the policies that some of these institutions follow? They're too good. Their grades are too high. Their SATs are off the charts. Why? Because Asian families culturally often say, get an education, work hard, do better. And therefore they're more eligible because of the cultural backgrounds and heritages of that cultural background. And they're penalized. Too many Asians would be accepted relative to Blacks. So we're going to penalize and take Asians who don't meet the standard grade and SAT standards, and we're going to take less of them and give to Blacks. That's discrimination for one group as against another group. In a free society, if an institution wants to do that, they're free to. One can criticize them, then one can challenge them. One can talk about the disadvantages of it, the cost-benefit disadvantages, as well as the philosophical inconsistencies of practicing liberal individualism. But if they want to, they are at liberty to do so and weigh the costs and benefits as a private entity. As long as the government is involved in education of one form or another, that is not going to be possible. The government will either say you have to do it or you can't do it. And that's the dilemma these institutions have. Now, the perversity of this, of course, is that these are the very institutions that say government has to be involved in education. Government has to be giving money for scholarships. We can't survive without government grants for our research programs, whether the social sciences, the hard sciences. And now they find that the very money that they wanted involves strings in a new direction that they don't desire. And suddenly they're shocked They're shocked. This is awful. Well, you've been hoisted on your own petard. You don't want it, then Harvard, it has enough of endowment, they could get by without government money. But they don't want that. They all want to eat at the government trough, but they don't want the consequences of that when the consequences are ones that they dislike.
Yeah, you've raised a large number of very interesting points. Your point about Hillsdale is especially interesting because Hillsdale's, when I mentioned the rare third case, you've got a totally private institution that is not subject to any government control at all. And one of the bizarre things I found about Hillsdale, Richard, was that here the feds are controlling all of these thousands of colleges and universities, but they're not satisfied with that.
No.
There's this one that is not subject to their control, and it drives them crazy that we just can't handle this. We have to put them under control too. So they start this extensive litigation. And, you know, my alma mater, VMI, went through pretty much the same thing. When I went to VMI, Virginia had a tradition of men's schools and women's schools. And this was just sort of a standard thing. And nobody questioned it. Just sort of I guess, the tradition of the state. But the feds come in at some point, and long after I was gone, and said, you have to admit women. And, you know, and I'm not here to say whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying that VMI should be making that call, not the federal government. And so there was a huge debate at VMI, and the Board of Trustees actually had to decide whether to stay on government funds. That was the real test here. And of course, as a libertarian, I was taking the position, get off the dole, like Hillsdale did. And it was a close vote, as I recall, but unfortunately they decided to stay on the state dole and therefore had to comply with the federal government's dictates to admit women. And again, what I'm simply saying is not whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's that the schools should have the prerogative of making that decision, but it loses that prerogative by going on the state dole. Now, that raises a moral issue. Okay, and right now, I forget what the figures are, but periodically I'll get a report from VMI that says that they received, you know, tens of millions of dollars to fund this building or build this building and so forth. And so the idea is, see how we're benefiting from this state largesse. But what they're blocking out of their minds on this is that it's money that's forcibly taken from the people of Virginia. And it's money that might have been donated to VMI voluntarily, that if they had gotten off the dole, then VMI would have been put in the same position as Hillsdale and said, hey, will you donate to help us build this building and do this and do that? Now, let's say that VMI needs 40 million to build some buildings or keep them up and so forth, and all they get is 30 million in donations. Well, where is the morality, Richard, of going to the state and saying the people of Virginia didn't give us as much as we asked for, so tax them, force them to take away that extra $10 million and give it to us? There's no morality into it all. It's just this legalized stealing. And this is what all too many of these institutions block out of their minds, that they're forcing people to fund things that they might not otherwise fund, or they might fund. We don't know how it would work out in a free market. But what we do know is that the only just society is a society where people are free to decide for themselves what to do with their own money, instead of this system of legalized robbery that underwrites these institutions and then puts them under the thumb of the federal government or the state government.
Yeah, the frustrating difficulty is that virtually from the early years of colonial America and then the United States, is that there has been a presumption among even friends of liberty, Thomas Jefferson being one, who believed that it was desirable to have a state institution of higher learning, the University of Virginia, which Jefferson was very much in favor of. There was this notion that a free society needs an educated population to be able to be an informed participant in political self-decision making in general, as well as just to be educated in certain minimal forms. And the idea that that should have been left to the marketplace or the private sector or uh, philanthropy and charity, was not accepted or understood or believed in consistently enough. So it has been the bane of free societies, including America, that it has been presumed that education is an essential responsibility of government, when the more consistent classical liberal libertarian would say that just as we certainly like it if little kids have shoes to wear, we don't expect government to subsidize and distribute shoes. Um, it would be nice if kids had something to eat, but we generally presume that parents buy the groceries and feed the kids. So of course, the government has become involved in nutritional things for kids since particularly Lyndon Johnson's Great Society era. But there are these presumptions that certain things are the responsibility of individuals and households and parents, and that is not the duty of the state to intervene or be involved without a variety of interventions that would be inconsistent with the efficiency of the market as well as the rights of the person. But unfortunately, education has been in this contradictory gray area virtually from the founding of the country. And of course, education is government virtually everywhere in the world nowadays. But it's that sort of beginning inconsistency that has run through it and has created this continuing dilemma. The idea of separating, just as we talk about separating church and state, it should also be a separation of education or schooling from the state. And if that was done, everything would be denationalized, privatized. And all of these issues that now are so controversial and disturbing that they've gone to the Supreme Court would have never had to be a judicial issue at all.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the secondary education part too, because we're not just talking about colleges and universities. We're talking about public schooling systems. It's the same mindset, Richard. Oh, well, if the state didn't provide a public schooling system, people would not get educated. We'd be living in an uneducated society, which is ridiculous. I mean, every child has a natural thirst for learning, and most parents are concerned about getting their child educated. And it's just that we've lost this faith in freedom and free markets because we've all been born and raised under this kind of system. And it's a socialist system. I mean, socialism has proven to be the bane of mankind. It would be difficult to find a better example of socialism than the public schooling system, state-owned, state-run, compulsory attendance laws. They have to use state compulsory attendance laws to get their customers, which tells you a lot right there.
And compulsory curriculum, and compulsory
curriculum, the books,
the planning of the content.
Yeah. I mean, your classic socialist model, and then everybody laments the crisis in education, but they continue to hold out hope that somebody's going to come along and show them how to make socialism work. Well, that'll never happen. Socialism is an inherently defective paradigm.
There's so also really the one other fact related to that is that if you want an effective educational system, that prepares young people to have the basic literacy skills that we often talk about, the old phrase, reading, writing, arithmetic, as well as other educational aspects beyond that to prepare a young person just as to be an informed person, as well as a career, which is going to be the more effective system, a private competitive educational system or a state system. It has become notorious now, angered more and more people because of the glaring nature of it since the COVID shutdown, that the public school systems have been failing. The teachers didn't want to go back to school. They were distance learning. The distance learning has turned out to be involving a year and a half, sometimes 2 years of lost education for an entire generation of young people in grammar school and high school. To give one indication, as you mentioned, I'm a professor at the Citadel. And at the beginning of this past school year, someone had come to our department, that is the School of Business, and had been talking about the incoming freshman class and what to expect from them. And we were told to expect that they would need more understanding and remedial help. Why? Because these were people coming out of high school in which for the last at least year and a half, they had been isolated and had been at home, and therefore had not learned things, had lost studying skills if they ever had it, had not been having their homework properly checked and corrected, or the interactions of classroom learning, and that we have to be sensitive to the degree of unpreparedness with which the freshman class was going to be joining us. Now, that tells you something about the general interpretation of what the government's educational system had been exacerbating during the COVID crisis that had been building up before that. And that is, when the government owns something, it's like the Soviet Union. You know, if the government owned all the stores, owned all the factories, the only thing produced is what the government ordered. You know, in the government stores, there was one motto, an unwritten motto: the customer is always wrong and a nuisance. Yeah. Listen, I was in the Soviet Union in its last years. I went to these gray, dingy, dilapidated, empty stores, and everybody there is a government employee behind the counters, and they're just daydreaming, waiting for the day to end. They don't care if they're goods that you want. They don't care if it's the wrong goods that you prefer not to have to buy. And every time you came up to ask a question or to make you were a nuisance. You were an irritant. Why are you bothering me? I just want to get my government salary and get out of here. Now, that's what happens when the government is the only game in town. Compare that to any store in the private sector in the United States, or basically any market-oriented society. The customer is always right. Service with a smile, varieties, choices. Can I help you? Could we special order something? Our price is better than the other guys, blah, 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 blah. Why should we expect it to be any different with education? You get to the schools, they're all government paid teachers going through a government educational curriculum to have your education certificate or degree to be able to teach at high school and below. And then you have a curriculum that's established. And whether you agree with the curriculum, whether you think it's a pedagogical, successful way, that is to get students, young people to learn, want to learn, to actually acquire knowledge. No, it's just what it establishes the curriculum and the pedagogy, which has become wokey. Now, you could say that before woke, there was the other one. Correct, absolutely. But today, it's a world that's upside down in content and pedagogically a failure, because the people there don't care. Now, that I don't want you to get letters or missives. Oh, I know teachers who care. Of course there are. I'm talking about the system as a whole, the systemic perversion of incentives, In general, you don't have to worry about losing your job. You're not going to be tested to see if you're qualified. You don't have to worry about any of this. They can't fire you. And as a result, you have less motivation, unless you're a special person who just really cares. But you have less motivation to be concerned with what you're teaching, how you're teaching, the responses you're getting from your students. And everything becomes teacher-oriented in finance and not outcomes for better students, because there's no competition. There's no rivalry. There's no nibbling at your heels for you to keep ahead and to do better, because the next guy wants to get the tuitions by attracting the kids to their school instead of yours. And as long as that remains in effect, this is going to continue the way it is.
Yeah, my sister was an elementary school teacher, and her daughter, my niece, became an elementary school teacher. When I first started practicing law in my hometown of Laredo, I, along with my partner, who was my dad, we represented a school board, and everybody was well-intentioned. Everybody wanted the right thing for the school district. My sister, my niece, and other school teachers, they really are sincere and dedicated people. It's just that when you have a bad system and good people, the system's going to win out every single time. And this is a bad system. And I'd like to say here before we wrap this thing up, Richard, that there's all kinds of people, especially conservative, but liberals too, but unfortunately libertarians as well, that spend their efforts trying to reform this system. And the most popular reform measure is school vouchers, where you're going to take money from taxpayers and underwrite private schools so that people can escape the public school system and get into the private school system. This is not the way to go. That's just another socialist device. You're taking money by force from one group of people and giving it to another group of people. You're putting the private sector more on the state dole and therefore more subject to government control. I say what we need to do as libertarians is lead America out of this socialist morass entirely, which is raising their vision to what is really the only permanent solution to this, and that's the separation of school and state. And I'd recommend our great book at FFF, Separating School and State, How to Liberate America's Families by Sheldon Richman. That is the only solution to this educational morass. Throw the government out of school at all levels, national, state, and local. So on that note, Richard, we'll wrap things up for this week's Libertarian Angle. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your support of our work. Subscribe to our FFF Daily if you don't already do so, and to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. And Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.